Delighted to welcome. There we go. Delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for a conversation about a new study released by the Fordham Institute, Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers. A few quick notes before we get started. Today's webinar will run for 1 hour. All audience members will have microphones and cameras off throughout the webinar, but we do encourage you to participate. You can submit questions at any time through the chat. Those questions go directly to our event hosts, and we'll do our best to get as many answered as possible. Now, I suspect you're here because you're curious about or directly wrestling with the conversations happening in schools across the country about equitable grading. Over the last several years, reforms like no zeros for assignments, eliminating late penalties, or allowing unlimited retakes have sparked both hope and controversy. Advocates argue these approaches can make classrooms more equitable, while critics worry they lower expectations and potentially harm student learning. Here at TNTP, we've also been exploring the connections between grading, attendance, and learning. In our 2023 report, Fall Signals, we highlighted the disconnect that sometimes exists between grades and actual student mastery. So we're excited and eager to engage in this broader conversation, highlighting Fordham Institute's most recent new study. In just a moment, you'll hear directly from David Griffith of the Fordham Institute, who will walk us through the key findings from this paper. After his presentation, we'll move into a panel discussion moderated by New York Times columnist Jessica Grose. We're looking forward to a lively, thoughtful exchange, and we're glad you're here with us. With that, David, off to you. Going to make sure. David, can you hear me?
Yeah. I apologize, folks. I am having a technical difficulty.
No problem. While David's getting that set up, this could be a good time if you did come with curiosities, questions, had a chance to browse the paper. If you want to put in the chat some questions that are top of mind for you.
Okay, I think I have resolved it. Does that work for everyone?
Looks great.
Okay, I apologize. I had replaced my computer earlier this week. All right. Thank you so much for being here. As was noted, our study looks at equitable grading through the eyes of teachers. We wanted to explore this because we had sort of the dim sense that this was out there and that a lot of this was happening, but there was remarkably little hard information about exactly what districts and schools were doing, what teachers, were sort of how they were responding to that, how they were feeling about it. So we already heard sort of some explanation of what equitable grading is, but I want to try to offer something resembling a definition. Broadly speaking, I think advocates seek to make grading less biased, fairer, more supportive of marginalized students. I think sometimes those goals are in tension with each other, and I think different advocates would probably articulate them a little differently. But I felt like I had to offer some sort of definition. So that's what I think the goal is from the perspective of the folks who advocate for this. And I think sometimes, or perhaps even often, I'm not sure about this part, it is linked to the implementation of standards-based grading. But I don't think these things are synonymous. So standards-based grading is basically the idea that there are particular learning standards that we want people to be able to meet, and that grading should sort of reflect those. And so this is entangled with it, but we really focused, for the most part, if you read the report, on the sort of equitable angle. And then finally, it's sometimes linked to changes in the grading scale, and I would say probably standards-based grading is often linked to changes in the grading scale. Um, but that's not really the focus of our paper. We're focused more on kind of the equity angle, and in particular on a number of policies that have generated controversy. And so we did, I think, lean into the policies that are most controversial in the paper. I don't want to suggest that these are all of the policies that are associated with equitable grading. I don't want to suggest that all of the policies that are associated with it are in fact controversial. But I think it's fair to say that a number of these policies have generated controversy, and I've listed them probably in rough order of importance. The most important one is this no zeros policy. This came through in the paper. It comes through in coverage of the issue, and it basically mandates that teachers assign a minimum grade of approximately 50% for missed assignments or for tests that are bombed. And there are variations of this, but that's the basic idea. There are also other policies, as mentioned. Um, you know, you can give kids a break and let them turn work in without late penalties. You can give them sort of opportunities for retakes. You can, you know, sort of delink homework from the grade or not assign points for homework. And similarly, you can take participation out of the formal grade. We came up with some sort of pithy names for all these. Obviously, the claim isn't that kids are not participating at all. But I think the point of the labels is you could get an A without any participation whatsoever, right? It does not factor into your grade, and the same with homework and some of these other things. So I'm sure we're going to get into all that. But first, let's just try to figure out what we're talking about here. Our first question was basically how prevalent are these specific policies? How many districts and schools are doing this? And then second, what do teachers think of them? And then finally, do teachers feel supported when they're trying to uphold high grading standards? Or do they feel that some of these policies are undermining them? So if you just look at the 5 policies that I mentioned, adoption rates, I don't know if you'd characterize them as high or low, but they're kind of 3 big policies. Unlimited retakes, no late penalties, and no zeros. And each of these has been adopted by at least a quarter, possibly approaching a third of schools in the country. And then no participation and no homework are less common. And then But then if you sort of add them all up and you ask, well, how many places have adopted at least one of these policies? It becomes clear that actually we're talking about a fairly substantial proportion of America's schools. It's at least half, right? It's at least half. And in fact, these numbers reflect the responses of teachers from K through 12. So we were including kindergarten and first grade and second grade and third grade here. And it's not 100% clear when we consider grading to become relevant. But the point is this is actually conservative, right? If we think of the grades where, the grade levels where grading is a big part of school, the adoption rates are actually higher. So moving on to what teachers think of them, this is our attempt to put it all in one figure. Basically, if you just ask teachers, do you think this policy is helpful or harmful to academic engagement? You see that overwhelmingly teachers feel that these policies are harmful. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. There is a lot of variation. And as is pretty clear from the figure, no zeros comes in for kind of particularly harsh criticism. But I don't want to skip over the rest of it. Teachers feel pretty strongly that including great participation in grades is helpful. They think that homework is helpful. The only policy that really kind of commands plurality support, or that teachers say is academically helpful, is this notion that, letting kids retake tests and try to do better on them, kind of promotes a growth mindset and helps them feel more academically engaged. then I'm painting with a broad brush here, but then so we kind of take that, ask some questions about that last research question, which is, basically, do you feel supported when you're trying to uphold grading standards? Because some of these policies arguably are lowering standards, right? And so this is not a surprising finding, but overwhelmingly, teachers say that their supervisors will be concerned if they give too many low grades. And very few say that they will be concerned if they give too many high grades. We can't link this directly, I think, to the other policies that I just mentioned. And frankly, I don't think that any of these policies really explains this result. I think we would get not that different a result even without these policies. So there's a lot of other things that are going on here. But it did come through in the comments that teachers left in the open response portion of the survey. And if you read the report, you know that we really had our choice of quotes here. But teachers had a lot to say about these policies. I have not, some of them, did weigh in favor of these policies, but many of them expressed frustration. And the single quote that kind of sums it up for me is that last one, which is, one teacher said, it's equity grading is not leveling the playing field. It is simply lowering these standards so that school districts can look like they're meeting kids where they are, rather than actually sort of holding them to a higher standard and getting them to learn more. So with that, I'll leave it there. Wait, hang on. I have one more slide there. So these are our recommendations. They're not necessarily the recommendations of everyone who's participating today. The report recommends that these policies be repealed where they've been adopted at the district or school level. We feel like it's one thing for an individual teacher to give a student some grace when that kid is experiencing challenges. But it's another thing to sort of proactively lower the bar or tell kids at the start of the semester, you're going to get half credit on assignments that you don't do. We feel like that's probably not advisable. And then our second recommendation is to kind of refocus this push for fairness in grading on practices that actually mitigate racial and socioeconomic bias. So the one I always use as an example is anonymous grading, right? It makes a lot of sense to me that we would grade assignments when possible without knowing who turned them in. Same for tests. And then finally, we feel like this is sort of a more longer term discussion, but we feel like it's important to incentivize administrators to uphold high grading standards instead of faulting teachers who do so. It's easy to blame administrators and demonize them, but ultimately they are also responding to incentives. And so if we want them to behave differently, we need to give them different incentives. Okay, with that, I will wrap it up and turn it back over to Meredith and Manaz here.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for summarizing the key takeaways from this paper. Next, I am thrilled to invite Jessica Grose to facilitate what I suspect will be a lively discussion, both among the panelists and possibly in the chat as well. Jessica is very fitted, and I will not do justice to her background as a New York Times columnist who's written so much about parenting and just the dynamics around all these different pieces. So Jessica, please join us and kick off the panel.
Thanks so much for having me. I just really love that overview. Thank you so much, David. I felt like you really hit all the high notes of that research, and allow me to introduce my esteemed panelist. Michael Farkash is the head of talent, teaching and learning at Vertex Partnership Academies. He started his career in public education in 2006. He's been a founding teacher and leader at 3 New York City public schools and has taught grades 5 through 11. Biv Hubbard is the founder of Learning Heroes. She has held leadership positions at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Widmeyer Communications, and Scholastic. Her public sector experience includes positions at the White House, the U.S. Labor Department, and the U.S. Senate. Adam Meyer is a partner of TNTP's Research Center of Excellence, where he has overseen the research design and analysis for many of TNTP's recent reports. Adam has worked as an educational researcher and analyst for nearly 15 years, and prior to that, taught high school math, physics, and statistics. Adam Tyner is the National Research Director at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Prior to joining Fordham, Dr. Tyner served as Senior Quantitative Analyst at Hanover Research. He also spent several years leading classrooms, teaching English as a second language in China and California, and teaching courses at the University of California, San Diego. So welcome, everybody. Adam Tyner, I wanted to start with you since you did a lot of work on this report. How did you get interested in this as a topic of research in the first place? And what has the adoption of these practices looked like? When do you think that the whole equitable grading movement really started to pick up speed?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I think what led me to get interested in this topic is that I feel like our field in education policy has not prioritized a focus on student effort. I don't think we have thought enough about why students choose to do homework instead of all the million more entertaining things that they could be doing with their time. And I think that it's kind of led us in some wrong directions. And I think it's difficult. We have all these questions about okay, so is it intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation, or what's the best way to motivate students? What gets them to apply their effort? But I think one kind of simple answer, at least kind of answering in the negative maybe, is that if we tell kids that they're doing okay, even if they're not really doing very well or they're not even doing anything at all, I think that kind of guarantees that we're not going to maximize their effort. And some of these policies, especially the minimum grading policy, the 50% rule, it kind of does exactly that, right? It gives you a nearly passing grade, even if you don't attempt the assignment. That's kind of a really egregious example. But there's other things too, like the removing deadlines. Deadlines are so important to holding students accountable. And just, by saying that there's never going to be any penalty for late work, I think that just really, it makes it difficult to motivate students through grades, which has been a big part of why we have grades in the first place. And we've done research at the Fordham Institute, and others have done this, that have found that lenient grading, if students have a teacher who is a lenient grader, who gives out those A's and B's and high grades without the student having learned that much, those students in those classes actually learn less when they're exposed to those more lenient graders. So I think the logic of that's pretty obvious. Philip Babcock, the economist, has a great paper on college students, but it shows that if they expect to get a lower grade in their class, they spend a lot less time studying. It's kind of common sense. But that's, I think, what led me to want to look at this. My colleague, Dr. Meredith Coffey, she had, wrote a review of Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, a few years ago, and we wrote a policy paper on this last year. And then, it kind of led us to wondering, we've been seeing this stuff popping up in the news around the country. We've had people contacting us, school board members and administrators contacting us, and some of that because of Meredith's review. Some of it because of our policy paper, but the truth is we didn't really know how prevalent this was. It was just anecdotes in terms of an idea of how prevalent this was or what teachers thought of it. And so that's why we did this first nationally representative survey of teachers. And I really don't have a great answer, Jessica, for how quick the uptake has been on this, because it's really just been a matter of anecdotes. I would say that this new, calling it like equitable grading, I think that's kind of new. I think that's kind of a rebrand of some ideas that have actually been around much longer than that term has been around. People like Ken O'Connor and Thomas Guskey have been writing about similar things, and really most of those ideas I think have been around for a while, but it's not really clear to me how prevalent, how quick the uptake has been. But what we can say is that there's a few schools, maybe 5 to 10% of schools, that are taking this really seriously. That's what we find in our survey of teachers. And a lot of schools, maybe almost half of schools, are experimenting with some of this stuff. So it is something that we have to take seriously.
Yeah, it's always a challenge when you're trying to write from a national level because there are so many schools and education is so localized. I feel like all of my stories are filled with 8,000 caveats, but there we are. You mentioned a little bit of this, but I would like to offer this question to anybody. What does the body of research look like on any of these practices, on no zeros or no participation, no homework, no late penalties? I mean, from what I've read so far, a lot of it is theoretical just because the uptake in schools is so new, but I would love to hear from anyone what the research looks like in terms of student achievement on any of these topics.
I mean, I could say, as somebody who's looked at this pretty closely, I'll give the other panelists a chance to jump in, but we looked at this in a policy brief last year. Meredith Coffey and I wrote this policy brief, and we tried to look at every piece of evidence around this stuff. And the truth is that the evidence for these specific practices is quite thin. I mean, we found a master's thesis that was able to show that, students didn't turn in their homework as often when you got rid of late penalties. There's some evidence that if you do minimum grading, more students pass, which isn't so surprising because you're kind of giving students lots of points, so it makes it a little easier to pass. On these specific practices, I think the research base is very thin. There's not any evidence showing that students are learning more if they are, get these kinds of practices. But I think the research that's really relevant and that we do have is about the student expectations and grading standards. And we really do have evidence that more lenient grading, that grade inflation is not a victimless crime. It really does lead to less student learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that NA NAP scores maybe are a wake-up call on that. So in my own reporting, I've found that very similar to your results. Teachers are not fans of these policies. It makes them feel like they can't hold kids accountable, and the kids know it. And my colleagues recently did a focus group with a nationally representative set of teachers, and they found similar feelings. If they are so unpopular among teachers and the research on them is mixed at best, why are they still being adopted?
I can start. I think part of the issue is that the practices are attempting to solve a real problem. At least it's a problem that we've seen from looking at grades across thousands of schools and classrooms over the last 5 to 10 years. And that is pretty much everywhere we looked, as Adam just mentioned, there are students who are getting good grades, B's or higher, who are clearly not meeting grade level expectations around achievement or academic expectations. And Manaz mentioned this at the top. We were able to really emphasize that recently with the pandemic and being able to show that unquestionably students' performance, their achievement dipped, their chronic absenteeism skyrocketed. But most kids were getting the exact same grades before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And the problem is not necessarily grades themselves. There is a lot of research that shows grades pack a lot of useful information about what students are able to do. Some of that is academic. Some of that is, I think, is what Adam is getting at around effort, diligence, reliability, all those things that do predict future outcomes for kids, particularly in post-secondary. And so when you have a useful piece of information like grades, but that when the signal coming home to students and their families and their parents is that everything is okay, it really prevents parents from fully engaging with their teachers, with their schools around when students are actually off track. And that research I just mentioned, post-pandemic, about a third to almost half of the students who are both chronically absent and not on grade level in both math and ELA were getting B's or better. I mean, those are all three of those things are clear red flags that something is off. And yet the message that families get from the report card is these grades are good enough. I'm sure Bid can layer in, but most parents see a B as okay. Like there's nothing seriously wrong here. And there were many students, and more so post-pandemic, where that's definitely not the case. And I think the grading system currently and the move to equitable grading is a way to try to address this underlying problem of the signals kids are getting are mixed currently. And so they're trying to find strategies to shift it to more something that does more clearly reflect achievement. I think the problem is by doing so, they're stripping away some of the other useful things about grades. And to Adam and David's research, it's causing other issues within schools too.
Yeah, Bib, I'd love to hear your response to what do parents think of these practices? Are they even aware that they're being implemented? How much information? I know it's sort of outside the purview of this report, but I wonder how much information is even being communicated to them up front when these new practices are being implemented.
Yeah, I don't think parents have a clear understanding that these practices are being implemented. Parents rely sort of on that report card grade as sort of the measure of their child's achievement. And when we ask parents, how do you know if your child is achieving on grade level, grades are either the number one or number two reason for how they know if their child's achieving. So for a parent, and as Adam said, it's like 79% of parents say their kids are bringing home all B's or above. So to that parent, of course, my fourth grader bringing a B home in reading means they're reading at a fourth grade level. Teachers know otherwise, but the system is broken and teachers are not expected to tell parents what is in that report card grade really explicitly as it relates to their achievement. And we hear from teachers, ask the same question, what's the best way for a parent to know if their child is achieving on grade level? Report card salt number 6. So there are all these other indicators for teachers that are much more important than that report card grade. Yet parents still, put the report card grade at number 1 or number 2, again, assuming that a good grade equals grade level mastery. And further, when we ask teachers, how well supported are you in communicating this information to families, only about a third of teachers say that they feel very satisfied that they've received the training that enables them and equips them to communicate difficult information to parents. So there's sort of this mismatch. Parents assume that no news is good news, and teachers aren't expected or trained to actually this information to parents. And so the resulting impact, as Adam was saying, is that 9 out of 10 parents, regardless of race, income, or education level, think that their child is reading at or above grade level in reading and math. And this is for 12th graders as much as it is for 4th graders. And so, you referenced the NAEP data. We just got the devastating 12th grade NAEP results. And so parents deserve and need to know if their child is performing at grade level, quite simply. And we need to do a better job of training teachers to be able to have these conversations with families. And we hear anecdotally from, qualitative research with principals, they don't want a parent problem, right? As the research showed, 84% of teachers said, like, I get my hand slapped if I give too many low grades out. And that is what we hear from teachers over and over again, and principals. And as David was saying, it's the incentives are misaligned. The principals say, listen, I'm hearing from my district leaders that I need to meet certain quotas. And again, I don't want a parent problem. So there are simple ways, common sense ways that we can address this, which is the good news. We can train teachers and principals to communicate with families about these issues. Families, parents are problem solvers. We want to fix what we can fix. But if you don't know your child has a problem, you're not going to take the actions that your child may need. And as time goes by, you're losing those opportunities. So it's a really important issue to uplift. And I think the grading is just a symptom of a larger systemic issue that we as a community can solve and need to solve.
And Michael, let's get you in here. I am wondering how students respond to these practices. I can tell you, I have a 4th grader and an 8th grader. My 8th grader is especially salty at the no, you can hand in things late, because she is like, I hand my things in on time. Why? and feels like, why am I doing this if the people who don't do this are getting the same? So even as someone who doesn't take advantage of that, I can say, at least from my N of 1, it is a little dispiriting. So I would love to hear from you. What's your sense of how students respond to these practices?
Sure. So at Vertex, we don't have 4 of the 5 equitable policies. So I can't say, for example, how students are reacting to having no homework, because we give homework. But the one that we do have, and where I'm a bit of a contrarian on the panel, is that 50 is our floor. So 50 is our 0. And it's not actually based on misguided principles of equity. It's based on the idea that it's just more logical and coherent. So, for example, if you look at I know we have a Portuguese professor here. They have a scale of 20, and a 10 is considered sufficient. If you look at Finland, they have a scale of 1 to 5 for their university setting. You can look at, there are lots of different countries that you can look at that do actually they don't apportion 60 points for one grade band. So I think there's something kind of illogical about saying that an E or an F, depending on your scale, is worth 60 points, but everything else is only worth 10. So that's actually how we do it. I think the bigger issue for us, and TNTP has another report called the opportunity myth. And one of my favorite statistics from that is, I'm going to read that students succeeded on 71% of their assignments, but they met grade level standards on 17% of those exact assignments. And so our bigger concern, as opposed to the grades, which I see as downstream, is the absence of task rigor. So it really doesn't matter whether you use a 100-point scale or a 5-point scale or some other, if the work that students are doing isn't aligned to grade level standards. And so that's much more our emphasis. And then I think the second thing, and the reason we reject the other 4, is that they don't appreciate effort. We believe very strongly that your effort leads to your achievement. We do believe that your effort and your study skills and good habits, temperance is one of our cardinal virtues. So we do believe that we need to develop those, and the grade should be a reflection of effort and achievement. But we don't think that saying that the floor is a 50, which again is just another way of saying 10 points at each level, is something that communicates the wrong message once you contextualize it.
And I mean, this is can be a question for everyone. How do we start better communicating both to students and parents what grade level standards are? I remember struggling with this during the COVID year when my older daughter was in 2nd grade, and I really wanted her to stay on grade level with 2nd grade. And as a parent, I was like, I don't know what a 2nd grader is supposed to know. I see her state level tests, and that is really good information for me. But even as, I'm college educated, I'm incredibly plugged in. I tried to find this data at the time and found it sort of confusing and hard to understand. So how are ways that we can start communicating that better to parents and students, even with these, 5 different new practices kind of aside?
I mean, I can jump in.
Yeah, I'd love that.
In terms of, parents, there's been a lot of talk about standards-based report cards that I think David also referenced at the outset. And those are equally super confusing. I don't know if you've seen one, but you get ranked 1 to 4, and your kid starts out at the beginning of the year with a 3, and then your kid ends the year with a 3. But the teacher's like, oh, they made great progress. Like, 3, what does that mean? It's just very opaque. So I think there are lots of ways that there are a lot of schools that are doing this well. So beginning of the year conversations with families, like what do you want your kid's goals to be from a learning perspective? Here's what the 2nd grade benchmarks are that they should be able to know and do very clearly. And then, communicate with families throughout the year to make sure that your child is meeting those very specific, this is what they should know and be able to do. There are ways that parents can ask simple questions at home, like, can you explain your homework to me? Can you explain this problem that you're trying to solve? If they can't, that's an indicator that you as a parent should maybe say to the teacher, listen, my child is struggling to be able to explain the basics to me. A lot of parents said during COVID that they would look over their kid's shoulder and be like, that does not look like 2nd grade level work, but they didn't know what to do about it, to your point. So increasing the ability to communicate between families and teachers is really critical, and is where we spend our time, is helping families know what questions to ask in low time burden ways, so that they can have more insight into what their kids are supposed to know and be able to do, and train teachers in culturally affirming ways to be able to communicate to families and translate all of this complex data. There's tons of diagnostic data the teachers have access to again be shared with families. MAP data, iReady data, DIBBLES data, a lot of that parents never see. So there's a lot of additional measures beyond the report card that parents should have access to know exactly where their children are, and so that then they know where to lean in and help support them further. So there are lots of ways to do this.
And so last question before we get to the great audience questions. I do feel like we are in this moment with the introduction of AI, and so many other sort of factors impacting education from the national level today. So many people are kind of rethinking the utility of traditional educational practices. Is there a way we should be thinking about grading and closing achievement gaps under these circumstances that maybe isn't this set of changes, but are potentially other sets of changes? Or are we saying the old way was actually good, we just need to enforce it, or actually go along, do a better job explaining to parents why we do the things that we do?
Well, I think that AI has really challenged the value proposition of homework, because it seems like the norm in a lot of schools is just that students just use AI to do all their homework because it can do basically all of any student's homework. So I think that really, I mean, no graded homework, I would be a lot more favorable to that idea today than I would have been a couple years ago, just because of the way AI has changed things. So I think we absolutely need to think about grading things that we can really validate, students' work, and whether that's, oral presentations, or it's, calling on students in class or having them explain their homework, or exactly what it is. I'm not sure, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what innovations we see there. But there's no question that AI is really changing a lot of this. I want to say just one quick thing though about Michael's stuff about minimum grading at his school, because I've noticed that a lot of these grading scales and the way that teachers approach grading is actually varies a lot. And like he said, different countries do this in different ways. Different schools do this in different ways. It's kind of, you could say it's culturally constructed what all of these things mean. What is a B? Well, a B means something different, as Bib has taught us. A B means something different today than it used to mean. And it means something different to parents than it does to teachers. And these things change across time, and they also change across space. And as with standards-based grading, which I think sometimes, there's some problems with removing a lot of short-term stuff and saying only your final mastery should count. I think that there's people who do standards-based grading who are super rigorous and who are really thoughtful about the kind of balancing act of student accountability. And I think Michael and his colleagues at his school are doing that. And so I would hesitate to ever say any specific grading scale has to be the one that your school or district adopts. But what we should be really careful about is districts deciding, okay, district-wide, every 0 is now a 50. Because that is just grade inflation. It's not thoughtful. It's not the balancing act of student accountability that I'm sure Michael and his colleagues have thought through very thoroughly. It is just this top-down policy that removes tools that teachers may be using to promote student accountability. So that top-down policy thing, which we've seen a lot of reaction to in districts that have done this, from parents and from teachers, that I think is just a lot more dangerous than, obviously, a lot of the grading reformer ideas have a kernel of truth to them, which is why they are attractive to, they do seem intuitive to a lot of people. And in some cases, I think they probably work fine as long as they're being balanced with, how do we promote accountability? What if students just stop turning in assignments? What are we going to do then?
Devil's always in the details. So to turn to the audience questions, could you please define what the Fordham Institute sees as the primary purpose of grades?
I guess that's to me. I don't want to speak for the Fordham Institute. I think I my personal view is that grades serve a bunch of purposes, and so I don't think that we should get too focused on one single thing. They're communicating information to some kind of short range stakeholders like parents and students. They're also communicating information to long-term stakeholders like, when you go to college someday, you'll probably put your transcript as part of your application packet. And so they're communicating information to different people. They're also giving people feedback. So for a student, if I'm getting a good grade, I think I'm doing okay. And if I get a bad grade, then I think, well, I might think a few different things, but one thing I might think is I'm not really getting it. I better do something different because this isn't cutting it. So the grades are serving a bunch of different functions. They've evolved over, the centuries or more. And people have been complaining about, well, really, they should be doing this. And the truth is they do a bunch of different things, and we have to kind of balance that. But they're motivational for students. So there's a motivational aspect to it too, but I don't think there's one clean answer to that, Jessica.
Here's another. It seems like many of the problems with these approaches to grading are obvious, especially to teachers. Why do you think they made it into such widespread use without much scrutiny or skepticism? I mean, I have a theory about that. I think my gut says a lot of these were adopted in the immediate aftermath of 2020. And so it was like schools were hit by a meteor and they had their hearts in the right place and they really wanted to find a way to help struggling students back from the brink. And a lot of experimentation, good faith experimentation was happening. But I think the outcome was not good. And I think that's the good faith reading. I think the bad faith reading is, or a more cynical reading, which maybe is true, is that principals and superintendents did not want to give bad news to parents, and that this is a great way to not give them much less bad news. But my sense really says that this started really picking up steam after 2020. If anyone else has thoughts. What would you say to the criticism that traditional grading almost always is inaccurate, inconsistent, and lacks meaning?
I can jump in a little bit. I don't know if I fully agree with that. I mean, there's plenty of research outside of TNTP, and we've looked ourselves at the relationship between grades and achievement, and that relationship is highly consistent and almost extremely strong. That grades are not random measures that teachers are giving out. They contain a lot of information about how young people are performing in school. Some of that represents academic performance. As I mentioned earlier, some of that represents other aspects that will serve, I think, youth well going forward, like turning things in on time and some of the effort-based pieces. But in almost every classroom, it's extremely difficult for us to find a classroom in all the schools we looked at where the grade, like the ranking of students' grades within a classroom, is not positively associated with the type of achievement they're getting to. Like grades are not just distributed randomly. That teachers are very good at sort of judging performance within the classroom. And when you think about that cumulatively, you have students going through K through 12 who are getting grade after grade after grade, and it gives like a pretty strong picture of how those students are performing. I think the problem is a lot of times it's just the differences in interpretations of what we mean by some of these traditional letters. Like I mentioned, parents have particular perspectives of them. Teachers have sometimes different ones. And I think in that miscommunication is where you run into some of the problems, because without that, grades can really be an opportunity to invite families in to discuss and have clear conversations around how their child is performing. We have a separate project where we're studying the practices of schools that have some of the best family engagement scores in their state and comparing them to schools within the same districts who are just, average. And some of the emerging findings are that consistent one-on-one conversations that are about student academic performance are what are much more commonly cited at these schools. And so I think when you have a grading system that, I don't say it's for better or worse, but that is accidentally distancing parents by saying everything is okay based on those built-in perceptions, I just think that's a huge opportunity wasted to really help young people who are struggling academically to get the support. And all the things that Adam mentioned around, or I'm sorry, that Ben mentioned around, here's all these other data sources. And if my child brings home a report card that I'm getting an A, it just lowers my intrinsic motivation to have all those conversations, because I think that they're doing everything that they already need to do.
Yeah. A question for Mike. Oh, sorry, go on.
I could just add something. I think what Adam said was really right. And I would just say one thing that we've seen in the education research over the decades is that GPA, grade point average, has always been a much better predictor of post-secondary success for students than just like your ACT score or your SAT score. And I think the reason for that is because of traditional holistic grading that incorporates not just do you know how to factor polynomials. That's super important, but it's also important to know, can you cooperate? Can you collaborate? Are you turning things in on time? And holistic traditional grading has always incorporated a lot of that stuff. And I think a lot of people think that's actually some of the most important stuff you learn in school, is that non-cognitive stuff. And I think that's the reason why typically grades have been the best predictor of post-secondary success for students. And we're starting to see that maybe going away a little bit, because grades are really getting compressed, especially for the highest performing students. Everybody's getting 4.0s, and so I think they're not having the kind of distinguishing power, the predictive power that they used to have, at least for a subset of students. But I think that we have some research that kind of substantiates that intuition that Adam is saying about the virtues of holistic grading.
A question for Michael specifically: why not communicate effort as a grade separate from achievement?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there isn't. So we're a big fan of Thomas Sowell here, and he talks about there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so I don't think that there is any perfect system. And I can't defend ours as the perfect system. We are doing our best to give families and students as defensible, as clear communication as we can about how their students are progressing, and I think predictively how well they are likely to do. So I think if you were to do it separately, so in some ways we're already trying to be countercultural by not inflating grades, right? Because you're competing against other kids all across the country whose grades are likely inflated, right? So maybe you're putting them at a competitive disadvantage. Kids who don't pass classes then have to retake them. Families, in 19 years, I've never heard a family say she was upset that I had given too high a grade, but I've had countless conversations about too low a grade, right? So all of those incentives exist there. But if we were to have an effort grade as well, is that going to go on a transcript to a college? I don't know, how is Yale going to read that Vertex alone does this? So I think there are systemic questions that have to be resolved that are hard for just one institution or even a few schools to resolve. And I think the other thing that's really hard on the systemic level is I taught 8th grade English in 2005. I compared the NAEP scores for 8th graders in 2005 and 2015. It was the same percentage of students who were proficient according to NAEP, but the actual passage rates were 52% and then 35%. And so if I'm even if I'm an 8th grade teacher teaching the same class, NAEP is saying one thing, the state test, to Bib's point, the state test is saying something different. How am I supposed to create a grade that is coherent? It's genuinely very difficult to do on the ground within this policy environment.
Yeah, and as a parent, I would say, I'd take the school grades as one thing, and then the state tests are another data point. The state tests come in over the summer. So what I've learned from my children's teachers, which they've all been great. I think they have been, really good communicators. I'm getting another data point, and it has lined up so far. But if it didn't, who would I ask? That teacher's gone, And I think that's, another sort of systemic complication that makes communicating clearly harder. Could the panelists share more of their thoughts on 0 through 4 grading? Do you see it as having potential to be more equitable?
I've got a hot take on it if you want. So I, again, like what I said about Michael's grading policy at his school, I think that whether a teacher is using 0 to 4, 0 to 100, letter grades, check plus, check minus, whatever they're using for different assignments is, I don't think we should try to impose some, coherence on all of that. But one of the concerns I have, so if they want to use 0 to 4 in some contexts, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be just fine. The concern I have is that you can read the advocates of 0 to 4 grading, what they say. You can just Google it and it'll be in the first couple of hits of one of the people advocating for it. They'll make this argument. They'll say, if you take one student who's got 0 to 100 and here's their assignments, and now if you put them as 0 to 4, look, they have a higher grade if we did 0 to 4. That's like an explicit argument. We cite one of those arguments in our policy paper, in our new study. You can find it in the endnotes, and it's an explicit argument for grade inflation. So I have no problem with however teachers want to, decide to grade in different ways. Different assignments might have different things, but if the reason you're switching is just to make grading more lenient, that's super problematic.
I would just chime in that, making sure whatever the switch is, teachers are very well trained and understand what that grade means, because over and over and over again, we hear from both teachers and parents, like when they make this shift, teachers are not equipped to understand even what a 0 to 4 even means, what those levels are, what the differentiation, is. And then similarly, parents are like, I don't understand here. So wherever, educators land, practitioners land, what works in their own local context is important, but just making sure teachers are very well equipped and understand what the purpose or what the framework is so that they can then communicate that to families, because we see that is a constant barrier when those, when they shift to standards-based reporting.
Yeah, I'll say that from the parent side, there's not that grading scale in one of my kids' schools, but there's a different one. And it was in part sold as, oh, it'll take the stress off the kids that there's not numbers or letter grades. And I can tell you that all the kids just want the highest tier. So the kids who are concerned about getting A's or 100, they're still concerned. They're just looking for whatever the different label is. And the kids who don't care continue to not care. So that's my, obviously biased experience.
Yeah. And then thinking about language barriers. So we do a lot of listening among Spanish dominant families, and many families in who come from Spanish dominant countries, like a 1 is the best. And a lot of these report cards are not translated. And so their kids don't want to really give them the bad news that they're getting a 1 or a 2, which is at the bottom of the scale, but their parents are walking away with the assumption, oh, they must be doing great because they're getting a 1 or a 2, because they can't fully understand because it hasn't been translated into their language. So there are lots of, again, these unintended signals that get sent home to families that can be addressed and should be addressed, but create the challenges.
Yeah, I think really briefly, my hunch is that no matter what scale you use or type of report card you use, if you think you're just going to solve it with a single report card and not actually pay attention to more consistent, frequent interactions with families, like you're not going to get very, very far. I mean, all the reasons Bib just mentioned, I think a lot of the problems just are based in misinterpretation, different interpretations of the same thing, and a one-time report card I don't think can solve that. I think it requires a much more long-term plan to ensuring that families are invited in to discuss their child's performance.
And we have time for one more question. So could the lack of research on these practices be partly because it would really require longitudinal studies done over many years rather than cross-sectional ones? In other words, we'll be able to know more in 5 or 10 years.
I mean, Adam, you can definitely jump in. I think that's partly true. I definitely think you need some longitudinal data would be really helpful to understand how systems who adopt these types of policies, how their other outcomes have shifted, how outcomes have shifted differently for different groups of students. I don't know if it necessarily takes 5 or 10 years. I think there could be at least some exploratory analysis on a much shorter timeline. And I think because this is a growing trend or a trend in enough schools. It feels like there should be a lot of upcoming research to look much more directly at this that does not have to wait for another decade or half decade.
There's one study I think that I wrote about out of North Carolina that was, I think 10 or 15 years ago. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it was a more natural experiment where one district adopted it and the district next door didn't. And so I think there's possibly more literature like that, which again doesn't take years and years and years, and it's more comparative within states, because as we all know, states are also very different.
I have just one question that I would be interested in hearing an answer to, which is, I think we come with a certain assumption of where the scores should cluster. So like families or scholars or or teachers, where it's, so when I did a little research, and 100, with a 100 scale, the average used to actually be a 50. Your median student would get a 50, and that made sense at that time culturally. I think now, obviously we couldn't do that because everyone, that would be a majority of our kids were failing. But even should most of them cluster in the 70s? Or really what I think from my experience is you're going to have a lot of work to do with families if they're not clustering in the mid to high 80s. And so I'm just wondering what expectation you're bringing to it and how that changes it, because I think that's true whether it's a 0 through 5 scale or a 1 through 100. It's kind of the cultural expectations that come with what is an appropriate grade. And what does this mean about my kid vis-a-vis other kids or in terms of proficiency?
Yeah, that's such a great point. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. I'm going to turn it back over to Manaz to wrap it up here.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Hypothesis confirmed. This was very lively. And more importantly, I think the conversation is going to continue, and the work needs to continue to not only identify what's not working, but what alternatives we can offer our educators, our leaders, our families, our communities. And so thank you to each of the panelists for your leadership in the space, for pushing all of us to have these difficult conversations in service of what's best for our students. Thank you all who attended today. On behalf of TNTP, the Fordham Institute, and all of today's presenters, thank you for spending the hour with us. We hope you will continue the conversation and the deeper work that's required. Have a great day.